Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Injury Law Pod. I am your host, Eric Bartlett, 28-year personal injury lawyer, and this is the podcast where we talk about all things personal injury law related. So imagine waking up one day unable to remember your own name, struggling to speak, or even perform the simplest task you once took for granted. This is the reality for millions of people living with traumatic brain injuries, commonly referred to as TBIs. And it's a silent epidemic that affects more lives than we realize. As we recognize March as Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month, we're diving deep into the causes, the consequences, and legal battles surrounding TBIs, uncovering the stories and statistics that demand our attention. So why is March designated as Traumatic Brain Injury Awareness Month? Well, really, there's no specific historical situation that led to March being the month to bring awareness to traumatic brain injuries. However, that month was designated to increase public education, advocacy, and support for those affected by TBIs. And again, there's no historical event specifically, but there's several key factors that contribute to its significance. Number one, raising public awareness. Organizations like the Brain Injury Association of America and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention use this month to highlight prevention strategies, the impact of TBIs, and what available support is out there. Also, with winter sports still in full swing and spring sports beginning, March serves as a timely reminder to focus on sports-related concussion prevention and safety. I would also point out that as spring arrives, people are getting out and about more. They've been cooped up in their houses, but now they're going out, they're driving more, they're getting on their motorcycles, and they're just out and about walking, all different ways that people very well may get hurt and may end up suffering some type of traumatic brain injury. It's also interesting to note that many advocacy groups use March to highlight TBIs in military personnel, as brain injuries are a leading cause of disability among veterans due to blast injuries and combat-related trauma. Also, there are congressional and legislative efforts underway. March is often when policy discussions around healthcare, disability rights, and brain injury research funding take place, making it a strategic time for advocacy. So throughout the month of March, various organizations host events, they share survivor stories, and they push for better policies, research, and treatment options. So in the personal injury world, we see traumatic brain injuries more than we would like to. And just as an understanding, typically speaking, a traumatic brain injury is going to be commonly referred to as a concussion. Now, there is definitely a spectrum of brain injury to the extent of, on one hand, a mild concussion. So headache, maybe fogginess, things of that nature. And then somewhere in the middle, you have situations where people's balance is affected. They experience vertigo. They may experience difficulty recalling memories, the ability to speak, things of that nature. And then, of course, on the far end of the spectrum are the very severe brain injuries that result in people being left in some type of a vegetative state. They're alive, but their brain is badly damaged and their body is struggling to function on its own. In the personal injury world, of course, we see all of these, this entire spectrum, and we see it from all different types of causes, from all different types of accidents that lead to various degrees of TBIs. So again, what is a TBI? It's a brain injury. It's a very serious situation. Whether it's a mild brain injury or a severe brain injury, you have to remember we're talking about our brains. the one organ in our body that controls everything. Not only does it control our ability to think, reason, speak, but it controls how our body works and all of the other organs and systems that are going on in our body. And so when something affects your brain, it's a really big deal. So when we call something a mild brain injury, again, it's almost not doing it the proper service that it should, because any injury to your brain is significant. And, thankfully, with heightened awareness in sports, I mean, especially the NFL, I mean, now they have concussion protocols. If they think a player has sustained some type of a brain injury on the field, they immediately pull them off. We've come a long way in recognizing the seriousness and the severity of these brain injuries and how they can affect people long term. But again, common causes are falls, sports injuries, motor vehicle accidents, and workplace accidents. People get hurt at work and it involves their head. And, we see a lot of that. As a matter of fact, we recently concluded a case for an injured person who was hurt at work. And I'll dive into that a little more down the road in the discussion. But according to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and their statistics, there are nearly 2.8 million TBI related emergency department visits each year. That's a lot. And there are approximately 5.3 million Americans living with disabilities that have resulted from TBIs. So again, this affects a lot of people in our population. The long-term impact of TBIs can result in, again, not only what I've already talked about with the ability to function on a daily basis, but another big thing that occurs out of TBIs is an emotional impact. And not only can it just affect someone because they are now suffering with a situation they've never experienced before, again, with difficulty doing things that they used to not even think about doing, their day-to-day functioning, things like that. But also brain injuries can also affect how someone's brain works in the sense of inhibitions. And a lot of times people with brain injuries have a dramatic personality change. Again, in my life, I personally saw this with a family member. And, I had a family member who was a young girl in a car accident, and she suffered a pretty significant brain injury. And that led her into a spiral of making bad choices. And it really affected her life in a very negative way because, again, some part of her brain was not working properly, was not allowing her to make good, sensible choices. And she went down a road of having a lot of problems that affected not only her, but her family. And so these things can have dramatic effects, not only physically, but mentally as well. Now, again, we talk about in the personal injury world and, what we're looking at, right? If somebody is hurt and it's whatever it arises from, whether that is a car accident, motorcycle accident, somebody falls because of a dangerous condition and they hit their head, or they're at work and something happens, they get hit in the head, something of that nature, whatever that looks like. Our job when we get involved as their lawyer is to, well, at least one part of our job, I should say, is to ensure that they're getting the appropriate medical care to address this brain injury. And the problem is, again, we've come a long way. But the problem is, a lot of times the person themselves may brush off what they're experiencing if they've had a concussion. As a matter of fact, I had a recent client who sustained a concussion, and they didn't even diagnose her for several weeks after. It was based on things that she was telling her doctors. And they finally were like, you may have sustained a concussion from this fall that you had. And we probably need to have you see a neurologist. And, she's just thinking that she's experiencing headaches, right? Maybe some fatigue, things of that nature. Light is bothering her a little bit, stuff like that. Of course, as just a person, we don't necessarily know that, hey, maybe we've injured our brain here, and this is just some part of my whole situation that's going on at the moment. But again, I've been doing this long enough. Obviously, I'm not a medical doctor, but if I see a client that is exhibiting what I've seen in the past as being diagnosed as a concussion, it's something I'm certainly going to point out to my client, that they may want to mention the symptoms and problems that they're having to their medical doctors to make sure that they're getting fully treated for this potential injury. When we pursue a legal claim that involves a concussion, again, we run into a situation. Insurance companies still do not take seriously enough concussions. So if somebody's diagnosed with a concussion and they have problems, and, again, it is going to depend on exactly what that looked like. Is that a couple months with a headache, with light sensitivity, with sound sensitivity, forgetfulness, things of that nature, and it resolves on its own? Or, did they get into the care of a neurologist who put them into special therapy? It's called vestibular therapy, to help them with balance issues, the light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, those types of things. Again, it all depends, right, on what this looks like. But unfortunately, even a minor concussion, especially if you go down the road and you have another concussion, concussions build upon themselves. And the more you damage your brain over time, the worse it can get. And so one of my jobs is to really communicate to the insurance company the seriousness of a concussion. And one way we do that as well is we have our clients keep a log as best they can. And even if they have to go back later, but to detail what they experienced, how it affected their daily activities, the things that they went through, to really show that this wasn't just, a little headache and that was it. And so again, we've been fortunate that with the awareness that's been brought about in the sports world, and also with the military, they give Purple Hearts now to injured soldiers, military personnel, when they sustain a concussion. And there's just been a lot of enhanced focus on TBIs, and that has helped other parts of the world realize just how serious concussions are. And that has helped us as personal injury lawyers get the message across to insurance companies that this is not just some little minor neck strain, something like that, right? This is a bigger deal. And sometimes, it takes forcing the issue. And if an insurance company isn't going to initially take a brain injury seriously, obviously we have to file a lawsuit. We have to fight it out. And what's important in that realm is having medical evidence of the concussion, the severity of the concussion, and the potential long-term disabilities this person is going to experience because of their concussion or their traumatic brain injury. Again, I I almost hate saying concussion because for so many years it just was not taken seriously. There used to be the phrase of, oh, that person got their bell rung, right? Ha ha. Yeah, it's like they don't even know who they are at the moment, whatever. And it just was not taken seriously. But again, today we have had a shift in the thinking about concussions and brain injuries. And so this has made things a lot better for those who are suffering from them. But again, when we are involved and there's a legal claim at issue, the importance of medical testimony is definitely a crucial piece of the evidence that is going to be at play in any type of claim involving a traumatic brain injury. It's really important as well that the sooner there is intervention, medical intervention, and proper documentation about a brain injury, that can really affect how that personal injury claim is going to resolve. Just like I mentioned a minute ago, if there's a situation where a person they don't recognize it, they're not bringing it to the attention of medical providers, and some amount of time goes by, and then all of a sudden, the word brain injury, concussion is coming up in medical records. That always leaves the possibility for an insurance company wanting to argue, well, what was going on for a month or 2 months before this ever showed up? This wasn't an initial complaint. Did they hit their head? What happened? So all of these things lead to the idea that the sooner somebody can recognize they may have sustained a brain injury, and again, what was the mechanism? Because it doesn't always mean you hit your head. Brain injuries occur when the brain moves around inside the skull. And that can happen from a severe, decrease in speed, say, of a vehicle. So a sudden decrease in the speed of a vehicle causes the head to move in a very significant way, which causes the brain to move inside the skull and actually hit against the inside of the skull. And that can cause a brain injury. When we look at some specific examples of maybe where we've seen brain injuries, one of the biggest that comes to my mind most recently is the quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. And again, if you don't follow the NFL, well, I do. I love the NFL. And, that quarterback, who has a very difficult name, his first name is Tua. That's easy enough. I think he has now sustained 3 brain injuries while playing in the NFL. And there have been the videos of where when it happens, he is out on the field and his body is kind of seizing up, and it's very uncomfortable to watch. But it's a very clear demonstration of, again, just the severity of how these brain injuries can affect a person. And interestingly enough, with his specific situation, he is continuing to play, probably against medical advice, but he continues to go out there and continue to play, even though he's had 3 pretty significant brain injuries in his playing career. And, again, brain injuries are something that, as well, even though you'll possibly recover in the near term, long term, they can really affect you later on down the road. And, unfortunately, in my world, I have seen, again, kind of the whole spectrum of brain injury. And unfortunately, I've seen it from, again, mild to where a person is hospitalized, they're in a coma. Sometimes they make it out of the coma and they have lifelong, very significant disabilities where they are going to have a medical life care plan. They're going to have to be taken care of for the rest of their life. And sadly, I've seen it where that brain injury, they never make it out of the hospital. They eventually die because of the severity of the injury to their brain. It can be a very expensive situation for someone that is affected by a brain injury. You know, the financial burden of a severe TBI is substantial. It encompasses the immediate medical expenses, the rehabilitation that occurs, and then the long-term care. And again, the estimates for lifetime cost are going to vary based on injury severity, the required care, and the individual circumstances. But the research that's out there indicates that the lifetime cost for an individual with a severe TBI can range from anywhere from $600,000 to almost $1.9 million. And so what happens is, if we're in a case with a severe brain injury involved, more than likely that it's going to end up in a lawsuit, because number one, an insurance company is not going to roll over and just accept the costs that are attending this significant injury. And so if we're involved in a lawsuit, that we need to understand so that we can make the insurance company understand, and potentially a jury understand someday down the road, just what this is going to look like for the future of our injured person. We're going to probably get a life care plan in place. That requires a medical doctor to obviously review all medical records that are relevant to date. They're going to examine the person that's injured and get a handle on what is needed right now. And they're going to project out what is going to be needed in the future in the way of, not only the medical care, but whether it requires any modifications in their living arrangements, things like that. And these life care plans can come out very extensive money-wise, again, just depending on what that person's going to need. If you have a 30-year-old that suffers a severe brain injury and they have a life expectancy of 75 to 80 years old, that's 40 years of care they're going to need. And so you can just imagine that's a massive multi-million-dollar figure that comes out for a projected life care plan for this person. We also have to take into account, again, let's just use this 30-year-old person who was working. You can take it a couple different ways. If they're single, they were working, they're no longer able to do the job that they were actively engaged in when they got hurt. Now you have this massive financial loss as well. So set aside the medical care that's going to be needed for the person. There's going to be this massive economic loss because they can no longer have gainful employment and make the income that they were making when they got hurt. And now think about this as well. If they have a family, they have dependents that rely on them to bring in income to live. Imagine the impact that has on that family. And again, that is something that if we're in a lawsuit, we have to get an economist involved, and that person has to project out the lifetime loss of earnings this person is experiencing because of their injury. And again, maybe it's a situation where they can do some other job, right? Not the job that they were educated for, trained for, had the experience, but something else. And that can certainly be taken into account, but they could definitely suffer a major economic impact to their life. So again, you have the care that's needed, you have the lost income that comes with these things. And so the cost can be astronomical when you start putting it all together to present as elements of damage in a lawsuit. The recovery rates and the long-term care needs of someone who suffers a traumatic brain injury vary widely. And again, it's influenced by the injury severity, it's influenced by the access to medical care and quality medical care, people that know how to treat traumatic brain injuries, and even individual factors play into how a person can recover and what the long-term situation looks like for that person. The good news is that with mild TBIs, again, you see, I put that in air quotes because any injury to your brain is a big deal. But what is classified as a mild TBI, approximately 85 to 90% of individuals with that type of TBI achieve a full recovery, usually in about 3 months of the injury. Now, again, I want to emphasize that while that's great news, if for some reason another injury occurs to their brain, these things are cumulative. And so now they're at a greater risk of something more serious happening, even if they have just another mild traumatic brain injury. And again, a lot of times the full effects don't come on until much later in life, because as we get older, we all experience a natural degradation of our brains. And so if you have any trauma in your past with your brain, that can certainly enhance the deterioration experienced in your mental capacity, your mental functioning. With moderate to severe TBIs, the outcomes are not great. They are more varied, and there are studies out there that report mortality rates, so death rates ranging from 18% to 75% among severe TBI patients. And as I talked about a second ago, I've seen it where people, they have a brain injury, a severe brain injury. They never make it out of the hospital. Some make it out of the hospital and end up dying prematurely, whether that's shortly thereafter or even within a couple years after experiencing this injury. So there's definitely a situation where, due to a severe TBI, it could dramatically affect your lifespan. Between 29% and 100% of severe TBI patients experience unfavorable outcomes, as they say, which may include significant disabilities affecting daily functioning. And again, I see a lot of that. I see a lot of people go for a long time struggling with activities that they were able to do prior to being injured, and then after they were injured. Only about 21 to 27% of severe TBI patients achieve a full recovery, which means they regain their pre-injury level of function. So that's a pretty low number. I mean, that's saying about 75% of people with severe TBIs make a full recovery. So again, that's why it's so important to really think about these traumatic brain injuries for just what they are, a really significant, serious injury. It's also estimated that 5.3 million Americans live with disabilities resulting from traumatic brain injuries. And again, that just highlights the long-term impact and the necessity for support and care through their life. Now, one thing we should always take away from a discussion like this is the need for safety measures and the importance of legal support for victims of traumatic brain injuries. So when somebody is hurt and it's because of the negligence of someone else, it's important that people are able to find resources out there to help them with the legal process that's involved. And again, a personal injury lawyer is going to be the best option. And obviously a personal injury lawyer that has dealt with traumatic brain injury situations and knows the ins and outs, knows the arguments that are going to come from insurance companies, defense lawyers, things of that nature. It's really important because, again, it can be so easy for people to brush aside the severity of a brain injury. And also, when we talk about this awareness, the safety measures, making enhanced features, whether, again, that's in sports, because, we have now, again, going to the NFL, they're constantly working on new designs for the helmets. And again, the concussion protocols that are in place now, independent neurologists that are on standby at every game to see, did this person suffer a concussion? They need to get out. They don't need to be playing anymore. And again, that is a far cry from the early days of football where concussions happened during games and players just kept on playing. And no one ever took the time to evaluate them and figure out how severe their situation was. I mean, you hear stories from former football players that talk about getting a concussion, playing the remainder of a game, not even knowing what they were doing. And that's really scary. It's really scary because they were out there taking more hits and potentially making things worse for themselves. But again, in the world of work, right, there's constantly efforts being made to make working conditions safer, to avoid brain injuries. In the world of vehicles, there's always things going on with vehicle safety to try to minimize injuries to the occupants of the vehicles. Sadly, this is my personal opinion. We've essentially had a change in motorcycle helmet laws. And, the majority of states now, if certain requirements are met as far as age, a lot of them say if the person has health insurance, then helmets aren't required on the roadways if you're riding a motorcycle. And sadly, like I say, I see it personally. I've had very ugly situations where people are injured riding motorcycles. Again, the accident is not their fault. Somebody else, a car pulls out in front of them, whatever that looks like, but they hit their head in the accident. And because they don't have a helmet, there's massive damage done to their brains. But again, all of this is to say these awareness campaigns are out there to try and improve the world we exist in to prevent these injuries from ever happening. I'll make sure to put in the show notes some of the organizations, support groups, rehabilitation programs, things that if for some reason you or someone may be dealing with a traumatic brain injury and you just don't know what's out there, we'll put some links in to help you find resources, because again, it's so important. And again, I can't emphasize enough, if you've sustained some type of a brain injury or someone that has, the medical component is so important. And the sooner you get on addressing the problems that you're having, the potentially better outcome you're going to have. And again, this is in the mild to moderate traumatic brain injury scenario as far as the ability to recover from them. Now, again, severe brain injuries, most likely those people are going to be under medical care because they are so dramatically affected by the injury. But again, it's so important. And, I would encourage everyone to get the word out there about the severity of brain injuries, about the severity of concussions, and don't let them go untreated, because that's the worst thing that you can do. And if for any reason someone or yourself has sustained an injury like this, you think it's because of a potential personal injury claim, you have a claim against someone else because of the injury, you're always welcome to reach out. we're happy to discuss your situation, see if we can help legally, and just don't suffer in silence. That's all I can say, because there's a lot of resources out there now. And so I hope you found this episode useful and informative. And until the next episode, I hope you stay safe, stay well.